How's it going, everyone? My name is Matt and welcome back to another video. Today I want to take some time and talk about the best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! We're actually in a really interesting spot in the format right now where Rage of the Abyss is legal, it's right before Bonanza comes out, and it's also before Crossover Breaker comes out, and this format is filled with some really cool decks, and outside of it being a very expensive format, I think the format itself is pretty diverse, pretty fun, and has a lot of really cool interactions. So I just wanted to spend some time, talk about the different decks, and say why I believe we are in one of the better formats in the time being, and go over my top 5 best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! So when looking at some of the best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! We really have to ask ourselves, what would make a deck good right now? Well, obviously it comes down to a deck having to be able to play a really solid engine that can set up interruption to stop your opponent from doing whatever they want to do. A lot of decks right now also have to be able to play through many different hand traps, including the Pirellia and Fuwalos, which are seeing a ton of play, and you also have to be a deck that can, by extension, play a ton of those hand traps yourself. There are very few decks in the format right now which can play fewer than 10 hand traps, so we really want to have a small, concise engine that can play a lot of different hand traps while also being very threatening and can play through a lot of interruption as well. Now, there are a ton of decks that meet those criterias, and I'm going to talk about a lot of them right here, but before we do that, do me a favor and smash the like button. If we can hit 200 likes on the video, I'll bring you my top 5 best budget decks for this format as well, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But with that being said, here are the top 5 best meta decks in the post-Rage of the Abyss competitive format. Let's jump into it. So starting off my list at number 5, we have Yubel Fiendsmith. This deck is really good. It is one of the better decks in the format, and the fact that it's sitting here at number 5 is really saying something. The deck can put up some of the most insane end boards in the format right now, pair with cards like Varudris, Phantom of Yubel, of course. You have Rage with the Pop Trap or the Reborn Trap as well. You can easily get into SP Little Knight on the opponent's turn with a ton of follow-up as well, and you also have your Nightmare Pain, which is other interruption too, plus tons of hand traps, and of course you can have Fiendsmith Desiree as well, which is a crazy card on its own. Essentially, this board is nearly unbreakable if left uninterrupted. The issue is right now, the format is so heavily defined by a card like Mulcharmy Fuwalos and Mulcharmy Pirellia, specifically Fuwalos, which really destroys this deck. You're going to be drawing so many different cards off of Fuwalos if your opponent plays into it that you'll be able to interrupt them pretty effectively, so that when you get access to your engine pieces, they're not going to be able to actually effectively deal with them. The deck has a ton of really good starters, but ever since we got the limitation to opening of the Spirit Gates, the deck has kind of fallen off at least a little bit, and the fact that Fuwalos is in the format now as well is kind of the final nail in the coffin for this deck being the best of the format. But either way, it is still a fantastic deck that has some really good opportunities to beat some of the better decks in the format. You definitely have a good shot against decks like Fire King and against decks like Tenpai Dragon, especially now that Yubel has become less popular. Tenpai decks aren't playing Samurai Destroyer as often, which was like the main card to beat that strategy, which is ironic because it just got reprinted in an OTS pack as well. But that being said, I think that Yubel is one of the better choices for this format and definitely a significant step ahead of all the other decks that are not on this top 5 list, but I find that for the time being, it just struggles at least a little bit with Fuwalos, and it can't play effectively a card like Dominus Impulse because you're going to be playing the Fiendsmith cards, and Light kind of doesn't work well with the Impulse. It just makes it a little bit more difficult to consistently play Yubel at the highest levels in this current format, but still a great deck nonetheless. Now, my number 4 deck is actually going to be Centur-Ion, and this was not a deck that I really had that highly on my radar before we got the new cards from Rage of the Abyss. Centur-Ion didn't get that many new toys to play with, but it is a deck that doesn't really lose to any of the major turn-ending hand traps like Droll and Lockbird, Pirellia, Fuwalos, and even Dimension Shifter. In fact, you can play Shifter if you really want to in this strategy. It's also a deck that has so much space for non-engine that you can just play the Bestials, which act as non-engine and engine for you, but also are going to be ways to draw you additional cards thanks to Branded Regained, and of course you have all of your just normal staple hand traps. You can't play Dominus Impulse, which is like the best hand trap for decks that can actually play the card, but you can still play a lot of other really powerful hand traps, including the Mulcharmies and of course all the other staple hand traps that I mentioned earlier. And even though you can't necessarily turn skip your opponent with Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity being banned, you do have Blazar Dragon, which is an incredibly powerful card, allowing you to get possibly multiple negates on a turn, multiple summon negates, and all these things. Blazar Dragon is a phenomenal card, and this deck, because it can summon it out so easily, it is one of the better options in this format. So yeah, Centur-Ion just doesn't have like the highest ceiling of any deck in the format right now, and it does rely heavily on the card advantage it generates and all the cards and all the hand traps it can really have in its hand. But I'll be honest, the deck is still extremely difficult to deal with because of how good it plays into the best hand traps in the format, minus Dominus Impulse. But either way, I think this deck is really in a good position going forward. We'll see how it does in the new format once we get Ryzeal and Malice, because those two decks are going to be insanely powerful. But I do feel like for the next month and a half or so, we're going to be seeing a lot of Centur-Ion. Our third best meta deck of the format is going to be pure Snake Eyes Azamina. Now, whether that's with the Fiendsmith cards or it's with a card like Dominus Impulse, you really can't go wrong because both options are very good for different reasons. Obviously, playing Impulse means you get to play like the best hand trap in the format, and playing the Fiendsmith cards gives your deck another level up, but also gives you a really solid way to play through Interruption and set up a really nice end board piece. Either way though, the deck is always going to be playing your Snake Eyes and Azamina cards, which are incredibly good, and because of that, you can also fit in a ton of hand traps. Like you can easily fit in at least 15 to 18 hand traps in this list, and you can easily go up above the 40 mark on this list as well and play like 44 cards if you really wanted to. The deck has one of the better end boards in the entire game with great follow-up as well, can play through a ton of Interruption, and can play their own versions of these really powerful floodgates like Skill Drain if it really wants to, because you can just send it to the graveyard with something like OSS or a Snake Eye monster as well. It has really effective ways to play around a lot of the best cards in the game and a lot of other hand traps as well. Like one of the easiest things you can do is play around Nibiru with this list, because you can set up a really powerful option like Flamber's Dragon, which can get you advantage to then be able to link climb again if you have been hit with a nib. Or you can set up an Ilya Sylvia for the Omni Negate, and because you have all this graveyard setup as well, when your opponent tries to actually deal with your board, you have so many ways to just interact with them with cards that aren't even on your side of the field right now. The issue I have with Snake Eye is that the deck loses really hard to something like Dimension Shifter, of course. It can struggle at times with Droll and Lockbird depending on what you're starting with. If it's going to be like a Fiendsmith Engraver or a Bonfire or even something like a copy of Deception, you can have a really hard time with Droll and Lockbird, but at the end of the day, it does have its ways to play through it depending on the hand. You also have a really hard time depending on the hand with Fualos, because you really want to try and set up a board with a variety of monsters that have really good effects. You want to get your copy of Promethean Princess in the graveyard, you want to get your IP and the Spell and Trap Zone to summon itself back out, and those things are going to require a bit more setup than the average deck. So because of that, a lot of your Interruption is kind of held off into the extra deck, so Fualos is going to hurt, but you also have to deal with just the effects of Snake Eye Ash, Snake Eye Oak to summon from the deck, even OSS to just give your opponent an extra draw as well. Perulia is not that big of a deal for this deck, I find, but in general, it's able to play really well into it and able to set up some really nice boards while giving your opponent minimal draws. The deck also does have a pretty good plan B when dealing against a deck like Tenpai Dragon. If they do get hit with a shifter, they can just go Bonfire, search for Ash, Ash search for Poplar, summon it out, overlay into Kikinagashi Fujo, and that way they have a way to just survive, which is really good, and that's like a one-card combo to be able to actually get that far, which is really nice. And it does have ways to play into other really good strategies like, of course, Yubel and even Centur-Ion because of the amount of hand traps it can play. So it kind of hits all the notes, which is really nice, and it is one of the better decks in the format right now, but not in that top 2 for me. Now, before I talk about that top 2, I did want to talk about 2 other decks that I want to give some quick shoutouts to. The first of which is going to be White Forest, specifically White Forest Toy Box. I love this deck. It is the deck that I've been playing right now for a good while and really enjoying myself with it. I'm not playing at the most optimal version to play the deck, but it plays through so much. It sets up a really ridiculous end board that's super layered and can set up a decent amount of interruptions while maintaining a ton of cards in hand as well. It's just a really solid deck in the format right now. Issue is you have to open up like a spell that kind of does something, so like either one of your White Forest spell traps or one of your Toy Box cards as well, plus a White Forest monster, and that's the only way you can really get the engine going. And it does struggle a bit with something like Droll, with something like Perelia, and of course with Fualos as well, and it can't play Impulse, so it makes it a little bit tough to consider playing it as the main choice in this format at an event like a YCS, for example. I also want to shout out Rescue Ace as a deck. Rescue Ace is obviously really good. We knew the second that like the Diabellstar engine came out and the Snake Eye cards came out that Rescue Ace was going to be a good strategy, but after we got the new wave of support with Poplar and everything, Snake Eye as a pure deck on its own was so much better than what you could be doing with the Rescue Ace cards that it kind of fell on the back burner. But nowadays, Rescue Ace is still really good because you have access to all these powerful back row cards to be able to interrupt your opponent. Cards like Alert, Contain, Extinguish, Rescue, all these cards are really good, and then of course you have Preventer as a great option, and Turbulence to get you access to all of these is still really strong. And on top of that, you have all of the Deception combos that you can go with and all the Azamina cards as well, 7 on Negate. It's just a really solid deck right now. Would I consider a top 5? No, but it is definitely one of the better decks in the format, and you can even play Impulse in the strategy, which is a huge deal in this format. Moving on to our final 2 decks of the video. Our second place deck for the second best meta deck of the format is going to be none other than Tenpai Dragon. Tenpai is terrific. I don't believe it's the best deck in the format because so much of what Tenpai actually does revolves around: did you draw Shifter? Did you draw Fualas? Did you draw Perulia? Did you open the OTK, or did you open a bunch of board breakers? It's kind of like you're just going around saying, you know what, did I get the hand that gets the OTK or not? And if I did, well, did my opponent set up a way to get to Fucho, for example, or they did set up a way to get multiple interruptions that are stuck in their hand to stop me from getting to the OTK. It's really hard to effectively play around Tenpai Dragon because there's no real hand trap that just destroys this deck. It's really difficult because when you want to interrupt them in the battle phase, they can a lot of the time just establish a copy of Transcendent Dragon for you to be able to just not do anything, which really does hurt. On top of that, it can play Impulse. I've been talking about it all video. Impulse is like the best hand trap, especially for decks that can play it, and the fact that Tenpai can do so easily is obviously a huge bonus for that strategy. Now, even with Pot of Prosperity and Sangan Summoning limited to 1 copy, the deck is still very consistent because it just plays more copies of something like their Dora Dora or even their copy of Genroku, for example, to get them to their board, but they also are playing now at 40 cards exactly, and if they draw one of their 6 Milcharmies, they can get enough draws to the point where they can find the way to get the OTK if needed against you. Overall though, the deck is really good. It just lacks any type of like critical thinking, I find. You can just slap down any 5 cards and say, did I win the game right now? Yes or no, and a lot of the time that's just what happens. I have a buddy of mine who played Tenpai at YCS Niagara, picked up the deck the day before, and he did it pretty well for someone who's never played Tenpai ever, and he's been playing it a good deal since, and even then, he doesn't really know exactly what all the cards do, but he's having success because Tenpai is just that good of a deck. And for those of you who are coming to the TCG after playing some Master Duel, you guys just got Tenpai Dragon there, and Tenpai's been dominating in that format. It's been doing the same thing over here. It has been absolutely incredible, but it's not the best deck of the format. The best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now is easily Snake Eye, Fire King, Azamina. This deck is incredible, and it's the deck that I personally played at YCS Niagara. I think this deck was kind of underrated. I was expecting pure Snake Eyes to be a bit better than it, but no. The Fire King cards are so incredibly good at being just grindy cards that interrupt the opponent in really interesting ways. Garunix is a fantastic card. Alkanix, the boost that this card gives to the deck is insane. And of course, Kieran being able to revive a card or summon from hand without targeting is really nice, and the non-target pop as well is also really cool too. There's just a lot that this deck can do, and you can still play a ton of hand traps, including Impulse, which is a huge deal. Fire King can play into Fualas pretty effectively. It doesn't want to, but it definitely can, because you can summon 1 time from the extra deck into a copy of Promethean Princess, and then revive back the Arvada, and that way you have a negate and a way to get Princess into the graveyard to then bring it back using its own effect to get more interruption. Plus you have all your cards, you have the follow-up consistently with Fire King Island and Garunix of course, which are great cards, and then your Ponix comes back to hand as well. Just so many advantages to play this version of the deck. Now I will say, if you don't have Impulse, I think this deck kind of falls below in the tier list. I'd rather play something like the pure Snake Eye with the Deception combo and of course your copies of the Fiendsmith cards instead, but either way I think Fire King is by far the best deck in the format right now, based on the fact that it can play through interruption, it can have a really good grind game, can set up a massive end board full with layered disruption as well, and can play a ton of hand traps. I just love this deck so much right now. I think it is the best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! But let me know what you think by leaving a comment down below. Are these the 5 best decks in the format, and did I get the order right as well? And were there other decks that I didn't talk about? For example, I could have talked about something like Mermail, which is really good at hand ripping the opponent and can also play copies of Impulse. I also could have talked about something like Memento, which is another really good deck that just happens to have some major flaws in this format right now. but overall, I think these are the top 5 best ones, and I really want to talk about them in this video. If you missed my last video, it was a discussion on hand traps, the best ones in the format. That video is going to be over here once the video ends. I want to thank you all for watching. Leave a like if you haven't already. Again, if we hit 200 likes on the video, I'll bring you the top 5 best budget decks in the post-ROTA format as well. Subscribe if you haven't already. And again, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.